Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of What? Exploring Old English. I'm Nat.
And I'm Marco. Today we had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Emily Thornbury. Dr. Thornbury has taught Old English for years at Yale University and has published many amazing articles and even a book called Becoming a Poet in Anglo-Saxon England. It's a fun read.
This episode will cover much of her area of expertise. By the end of this talk, you can expect to know everything about ornamentation, poetic networks, and aesthetics in Old English literature. If you don't know what these things are, no problem. Dr. Thornbury does an excellent job explaining all of these scholarly fields of research so that everyone can understand them.
So without further ado, let us begin our conversation with the Lionized Dr. Emily Thornbury.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Let's jump right in. What sort of stuff do you work on?
So I'm working on a couple of different projects right now, one of which is on ornamentation in it really sort of the early Middle Ages, but England in particular, since that's my area of specialty, and thinking about what the highly ornamented style of Latin and Old English literature and also the art of the period tells us about the philosophy, actually, that went into making it. So thinking about, for example, what it means for a surface not to conceal something, but to be the essence of the thing itself. So if you think about, oftentimes we talk about a work of literature as like being deep, or that's we think about the superficial as something that is distracting from the actual nature of the thing. If you don't think about the world that way, if you think about what the thing is as being created by what it appears to be, there are all sorts of consequences actually for thinking about even the nature of truth and the way that you would go about pursuing the truth. In a lot of Old English literature, the idea of hunting is one of those metaphors for seeking out the truth, where you're following a visible track instead of digging, for example, to get to the truth. So have you all read King Alfred's preface to the Pastoral Care?
No, I don't think we've read that. We were looking at Alfred's Code. Is that similar?
Well, so yeah, his law code is a quite interesting document, and the preface to it is also fascinating. I would recommend reading the preface that accompanied his translation of the Pastoral Care. It's one of the earliest known sort of independent prose texts from Old English, something that's not translated from Latin. And in it, Alfred puts forward a program for education. You can find a translation of it pretty readily in lots of different places, but there's a sort of a collected volume, which I think is just called like the Life of King Alfred the Great. The bulk of it is a biography of Alfred, but then there's a bunch of other texts alongside that. And one of the metaphors that Alfred uses for thinking about how the people in the generations before him had lost the knowledge of Latin and the knowledge of all sorts of other things. He thinks about them as people who were too proud to get down from their horses to look at the track of the animal. And so they've lost then the trail and are then without the knowledge that they would once have been able to pursue.
I'm just wondering, how did Latin and Old English coexist during this period? Was Latin primarily reserved for the elite, while Old English was the vernacular?
Interestingly, no. Especially in the later part of the period, it certainly is the case that ordinary people would all have spoken English, but it seems like rich and important people also spoke English. A few aristocratic lay people did learn Latin, it seems like, in part because they seem to have found it interesting, but sometimes also it seems like as part of their spiritual practice. But English became a language of state really early on, certainly by the turn of the 10th century. And Alfred was part of this. So Alfred's law code is put forward in English instead of Latin, for example. And very sophisticated writing was going on in English, alongside Latin, which continued to be important. And Latin was, obviously it was the language of the church, but it was also the language of international dialogue. So diplomats, for instance, would need to know some Latin.
On the note of the clash between Latin and Old English, we were looking through a publication of yours. I think it was called Aldhelm's Rejection of the Muses and Mechanics of Poetic Inspiration in Early Anglo-Saxon England. Whew. Wherein Aldhelm rejects the idea of Greco-Roman muses/divinities and substitutes it for something more Christian. Was this practice common at the time, an Anglo-Saxon replacement of these symbols?
Yeah, it was. And starting quite early in the Christian era as well. The pagan literary classics were something that people who were brought up in aristocratic culture didn't want to give up. This was an important part of their identity. So a solution to that for people who were trying to Christianize this class or from that class, but also Christian, was to import a bunch of pagan, or to work within the models of pagan literature, but to substitute Christian subject matter and some Christian expressions for the more sort of egregiously pagan parts, but to continue writing literature within the same tradition. So what Aldhelm was doing was, I think, very much in line with what other people that he had read who had been writing 300 years before in Rome were also doing. So he had a model for that. But what's interesting of the fact that he did that, though, is that Aldhelm himself wasn't brought up in this tradition. I mean, for somebody raised in England, like Virgil didn't really mean that much to them. It's certainly not as a patriotic figure, but they chose to put themselves within that literary tradition. And so I think that was part of the work that Aldhelm was trying to do.
I see. Was there a significant transmission of classical Roman ideas to the Frankish and English cultures, despite their obvious geographical isolation? And if so, how are these ideas adapted or preserved?
Oh, yeah. There were, so first of all, there was really a lot of trade between England and various parts of the continent. So we know that there was a lot of intermarriage, for instance, between the southernmost kingdom of Kent and the Merovingians. So there were already people going back and forth, and there were also ideas and books going back and forth. And when Pope Gregory decided to send a mission at the very end of the 6th century, there were already sort of people for the missionaries to talk to who had come from the continent and were receptive to hosting those ideas and to helping promulgate them. So there were ways to disseminate these ideas. And by sort of voluntarily embracing them, especially embracing them as sent directly from Rome, the English kingdoms were able to establish their cultural independence from bigger kingdoms like Francia, for instance, by whom they might otherwise be overshadowed. And this seems to be a common gesture among like sort of early medieval pagan kingdoms to decide voluntarily to accept Christianity, but only directly from the Pope, as a way of sort of fighting back culturally against their bigger neighbors. So for instance, Poland did this as well. So the Germans were like trying to evangelize them. They wanted to hold the line culturally, and so they sent to the Pope for missionaries. So there's a lot of complicated cultural dynamics going on in this period for thinking about your relationships to the other people around you, but also your independence from them.
Hmm. So, sort of zooming back to ornamentation, is there a single text or manuscript that surprised you, caught your attention the most? One that maybe people previously hadn't thought much of, but through the scholarly lens of aesthetics or ornamentation, it's actually kind of interesting?
Well, Aldhelm's Latin, I think, is a good example of this. Um, people, you can't read it without seeing how highly ornamented it is. And people have been kind of, first of all, baffled at like what exactly he was trying to do, why people would want to read this, because it was really popular. Um, and it's this sort of extremely long twinned work on the virtue of virginity, with all sorts of examples of virgin saints of both sexes. The treatise actually was dedicated to the women of an abbey who seemed to have been writing to Aldhelm and in Latin, it would seem, and who, if they were able to read this, were very highly educated. But the question of like why anybody would A want to write like this, B want to read like this is one that people have been wrestling with. And I have been trying to think about what it is that's so hard for us as modern readers to appreciate about this text, and then also what you have to think about the world in order to want to write like that and to want to read literature of that sort. But I mean, to be fair, I'm also looking at much more famous works like for example, the Lindisfarne Gospels, um, which are highly ornamented, but I think like everybody thinks that they're beautiful. They're like, scarves and mouse mats and things like that with images from the Lindisfarne Gospels. So that's not hard for us to accept in visual art. But when you take that same aesthetic and put it in literary art, it feels like a bridge too far. And I think that's partly because of what we assume literature ought to be trying to do, which is like to provide a window instead of to provide a surface.
On the topic of disseminating ideas, could you talk a bit about your work in becoming a poet in Anglo-Saxon England? We, as a club, have spent a great deal of time looking at it during our lessons, especially on the concept of poetic networks, something that I think is especially remarkable.
So becoming a poet was the result of a realization that poetry was, especially in Old English, a language, that it was something that you could learn to speak. And it was both part of the sort of the ordinary discourse of Old English, but it also had its own syntactic rules in addition to metrical rules, its own vocabulary. And so what I wanted to do was to try to understand, so if it's a language, and ultimately I came to feel like there were even sub-dialects of that poetic language that we can still trace out, which point then to individual poetic communities that were shaping people's experience of poetry as creators of it and as hearers of it. So I wanted to try to understand what it meant to create poetry in a community, what the sort of expectation of other people listening to you and having thoughts and opinions about your poems would do to those poems. And then also to think about the reverse circumstance. What if you're isolated from a community like that? What would you then do? And I think that we can see marks of that isolation in the slightly weird poetry of a variety of either very small communities or of individuals who, especially with the Latin, I think just got better at Latin than anyone around them. And so consequently didn't really have anybody to talk to about their work, even if they might be themselves very highly appreciated for the poetry that they were creating. Um, So yeah, I think that that kind of sums it up. I wanted to understand like what the normal way of becoming a poet was, which I think is in dialogue with other people, and then what happens when that breaks.
Let's see. Like you mentioned these terms. I'm gonna butcher the pronunciation. Shop, Leothhuerta, Poeta. How do they sort of self-identify with these roles? As poets, Nat, you wrote this question.
Yeah. So you mentioned that poets in Anglo-Saxon England didn't really belong to a singular class, and so how did the feudal, or was this feudal or something pre-feudal, the feudal social structure influence their roles and status within society?
Well, it was pre-feudal.
Okay.
So when we talk about society being feudal, we usually mean something quite regulated in terms of formal oaths of fealty, of distribution of land in those networks. But at the same time, there would have been major landowners and then people farming their land as tenants. So it's not it's not totally just different from that. But it would be class based,
Hmm.
but not as um, highly differentiated in terms of the number of layers of classes that we
Okay.
get in later society.
And so where does the poet fall in that spectrum?
Well, I think actually there would be poets of all classes,
Really?
that this was a a language that would have been accessible to everybody in one form or another. I do think it's very likely that poor people would have been talking to each other, and their poetry would be different from that of royal courts. But I think that to just be able to compose a poem wasn't unusual. I think that it was something that probably pretty much everybody could do. Um, and I think that that's part of what is going on in the story of Cadman, for example, that Cadman's inability to compose poetry made him a weirdo, and he was deeply ashamed of this. And eventually he was divinely inspired to be able to do this. But I think it's really striking that people who were farm workers were sitting around in the evenings and singing songs, which presumably were in Old English verse.
Is this poetry, art, a tool in any way? Like, does it have a use or is it just for beauty?
Um, I mean, that's an excellent question, and the answer is both. And it depends partly on who is making the poem and for what. Um, a lot of the poetry that survives because it was written down and stored in monasteries. And a lot of those poems were very much for cultivating religious devotion. But there are lots of others that are for more ambivalent things, the riddles, for example, which in one sense are tools to help cultivate discernment, but they also just seem to be fun. Um, there are stories about um, poems of political satire that don't seem to have survived. So there could have been entire genres of poetry that had a very specific function, like criticism of the elites. And we unfortunately don't really have those. We do have some poems that are basically political propaganda. The ones that are preserved in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle seem to be very much designed to um, elevate the image and the deeds of the English kings.
So, on that note, we've spent a lot of time exploring the Exeter book riddles and had a spectacular session with Dr. Megan Cavell and Dr. Jennifer Neville, which the group really enjoyed. Were these riddles primarily created for entertainment, or did they serve broader cultural or educational purposes?
Well, okay, opinions differ. Some people feel that the riddles were basically like school texts. So their writers would be delighted that your high school club was spending time thinking through the riddles with the goal of teaching close reading. I think, is a fair way of putting this, which for people in monasteries was of the utmost importance because being able to interpret the Bible was the core of what they did. But some of the Old English riddles, like for example, the onion riddle, like how is that teaching you to interpret the Bible, really? I think that um, I while I think there are definitely some riddles that do have that goal of cultivating interpretation as a skill, and the Latin riddles that survive, they seem to be more in line with that. Others, like they seem to be for fun, and um, they're part of also of like a pan-European tradition where there are analogs of some of those riddles in many other languages.
So, I guess for a bit of context, comparing the role of the Anglo-Saxon poet to the nearest relatives, like the Carolingian court poets or the Norse skalds, what are some distinguishing factors? Like, what sets the authors of early medieval English poetry apart?
So what is interesting is like the poetry, at least that survives, seems to be less involved in political propaganda than at least some of the surviving Merovingian court poetry and also Old Norse court poetry. I do think, though, that in terms of social status, the Skalds were probably closer to their sort of English cousins than we have always realized. So because these people oftentimes were given the surname of Skald, we think that was their day job, when really, for the most part, these people were participating in society on other terms. They were warriors, they were farmers, and being able to compose poetry was something that most people could do, but they could do better. And so that was a distinguishing quality. I think probably there was something similar in England, but at least from what we can tell, there doesn't seem to have been a regular designation given to people who excelled in poetry. We don't, for example, have any surviving people who were called the shop, in the way that there's a number of people who are called a skald in Old Norse. I think there's a variety of ways that one can interpret that, but I think it does have in part to do with changes in the political structure in the later 10th century. And there was a movement in England as well to poetry that was more like what we see in Scandinavia, in part from Scandinavian influence, of course.
Now, this isn't the greatest question for discussion, but I've noted that a lot of scholars study both Old English and Old Norse, despite their apparent geographic and cultural differences. Is this due to linguistic connections like the runic overlap, or is it something else? I don't know, a shared literary tradition?
Well, the languages are pretty closely related, and in a number of the sagas, they talk about England and Norway or Denmark as speaking the same language. That doesn't seem to have been like true in a literal sense, but there seems to have been a lot of mutual intelligibility. But then also, big parts of England were settled by the Norse. England was conquered by the King of Denmark for a while. So there's a lot of cultural overlap, and there are also in Old Norse literature stories of people going to England and doing things. Actually, have you read Egil's saga?
No. No? Yeah.
Highly recommend. I think y'all would love it. So this is one of the sagas of poets, and Egil Skallagrimsson was considered like one of the premier poets, just like full stop. And he spent in his saga, we are told that he spent quite a lot of time in England serving King Athelstan. And there are sort of poems associated with this. And Athelstan seems to come out of this pretty well. There seems to be some real admiration for the English kings as opposed to the Norwegian kings who are like more jerks. Like in terms of like why there's so much overlap in terms of like scholars doing one or both, like part of it is the buy-in with the language. If you've learned Old English, it's somewhat easier to learn Old Norse. And in terms of university structures, you tend to have like sort of professors of old stuff, and like you might as well add another thing to your repertoire. But beyond that, there's a lot of real, like genuine cultural overlap.
So back to the thing about Old Norse and Old English scholars being lumped together. How is the study of Old English structured within your department at Yale? Is it part of a broader medieval studies program, and do you have many colleagues specializing in Old English? Or is it a more individualized focus?
I'm actually very lucky to have a colleague who also works on Old English. She is actually in the ethnicity, race, and migration program, not in English, and uh, she um, she was hired to teach Indigenous studies, which she does, but she's looking at um, Old English material, particularly the laws, through a lens of Indigenous studies. It's really interesting work. Um, and so she is moving towards finishing her first book, which I think is going to be really exciting. Um, so medieval studies at Yale doesn't, like technically speaking, have faculty. Everybody is appointed in a separate department, and medieval studies is interdisciplinary. It's unusual in that it does actually have students that are admitted directly to just do medieval studies, um, as opposed to many other places where it's the same as with the faculty. You'd be admitted to do French, and then you would be part of medieval studies if you did medieval French. Um, our people in the medieval studies program do hang out with other people in other departments, particularly medievalists, but also others. But it's exciting to be part of a program where somebody can um, design a project that wouldn't really fit into any sort of traditional disciplinary boundary, and approach questions to do with, medieval history, culture, technology in this way.
Wow. Okay, so another major thing you seem to focus on is aesthetics. For our listeners, maybe you could explain what aesthetics even are, like in reading literature. How does it relate all the way back to Plato and Aristotle? What is it?
Okay, so this is a big question, but an important one. Aesthetics is the study of the principles that guide the judgment of art, I think would be a way of summing this up. So there would be different schools of thought on the nature of what makes a good artwork. So with Aristotle, for instance, the idea of unity and harmony and proportion is absolutely central. And his aesthetic ideas were highly influential in Western culture more generally. I think that other traditions have different kinds of priorities. And when we don't have aesthetic treatises written by or from within that culture, then we have to reconstruct those principles from the artworks itself. And that's the kind of work that I'm doing. Other people do actually that kind of aesthetic work for contemporary culture, working out. Well, one scholar that I think is really fascinating in terms of her methodology is Sian Nye. She has a book called Our Aesthetic Categories, which for her are the cute, zany, and interesting, which none of which are quite what you would expect as an aesthetic category. But she works through what it is that we are doing when we say that something is cute. And I think that by seeing that kind of work done in contemporary material, we can understand the kind of work that's necessary to for example, understand early medieval art.
A little while back, you mentioned something about visual and literary arts mixing. So, how did ornamentation in medieval visual arts manifest itself? And how does it relate to or reflect the themes found in the literature? For reference, we've spent a lot of time on both verse and prose in Old English, but honestly, very little on the visual arts of the period.
So I think that, well, so in one sense, ornamentation is something that we can kind of recognize. We know it when we see it to a certain extent. But I think that trying to create a working definition of what would constitute an ornament is it's mainly helpful for defining a group of things that you would want to study. It ceases to be helpful when it's about sort of drawing a rigid boundary and deciding whether things fall on one side or the other of it. I think that that just becomes a parlor game and ceases to be useful. And what's interesting about the way that ornamentation is discussed in Old English especially is that it really can include everything. This is actually part of a much greater discourse that we see in other cultures too. So, for example, one of the words for ornament in Greek is kosmos, which is the word for everything as well, for universal order, but also beauty. So the idea that ornamentation is an act of creation, also an act of ordering, is one that has been very familiar to art historical criticism. What's interesting in the work that I've been doing is that ordering seems to be less important for how ornamentation is imagined as constituting things that are ornamented. Yeah, so it's less about establishing hierarchies, for instance, or directing your attention to the important thing and away from the unimportant things, and more about continually creating things by means of ornamenting them.
I'm sort of getting the picture that ornamentation is a very abstract thing. So, how does one go about researching something that is both ancient and indefinite?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the sort of key technical problems to thinking about big questions. You have to have concrete evidence that people can understand, and then you have to have sort of interlocking gears that get people from the quotation of the poem or the image of this object of gold work to more abstract ideas about the nature of surface and depth, or even nature itself. So I would say it's about selecting evidence, then clustering evidence so that people can see it in larger categories, and then moving from that to ultimate levels of abstraction. And that, I mean, that's kind of a lot of the work of a big project. Do y'all write like senior research projects in your school or anything like that?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, I haven't. We're juniors, so we haven't seen the prompt yet, but I think it's some sort of big paper over a span of a couple months.
Yeah, well, so you may be experiencing this problem yourselves, depending on, what direction you decide to go with your project. But it's one of the things that is both really exciting and rewarding about this kind of research, but also it makes it work, because you have to think about not just how am I understanding this, but it's how is a reader going to understand this? And part of it too is just being in dialogue with other people and like asking them, does this make sense? Do you understand how I got from A to Q?
I like to think nowadays, we go on Facebook or Instagram and see an aesthetic body or dish or an aesthetic house. And, inside the house, pretty Christmas ornaments. It seems now that these words really just mean pretty. In the lens of an Anglo-Saxon poet 1,000 years ago, how are these concepts different? Obviously, they didn't have an exact word connoting the modern ornament or aesthetics, but I guess more broadly, how have these ideas changed over time?
In one sense, I think they wouldn't, in that I think that describing something as pretty, I think people would grasp that. There are some pretty, I think, basic transhistorical elements. But the question of what you would find pretty and why, that is what changes. And people have very, very different values, for example, for intricacy and complexity versus simplicity. And so, again, on Instagram, there's a big divide between people who love lots of swirls and curlicues versus people who love, like, the clean lines of modernist architecture. And although they may not believe that the other finds like these things just like beautiful in themselves, I think people are sincere in these different aesthetic preferences, but they may have come to them by different routes as well. And part of it has to do with the kind of communities in which they grew up, the kind of formal teaching that they received. Were they taken to museums of modern art and told, behold this Rothko, this is beauty? And then they were sort of required to cope with this. So I think that on Instagram, you could do a lot of like really interesting vernacular aesthetic theorization.
Well, what's next for you?
So I have a couple of other projects on the horizon. One that I'm already sort of in the early stages on is actually about historical optimism in the 8th century. I think that people at that period in England felt sort of positive about the way that the world was going. And like, not that they thought that everything was magically great, but they felt a sense of agency over their world, which manifests in, I think, some really interesting ways in the literature of the period. So that's something that I'm working on. I also am interested in and this is a more inchoate project on basically just sort of weird medieval Latin. So, for example, I've been looking at some Latin poems that are in Old English meter. So, which is, I think, just really fascinating because this would have been totally opaque to people who did not speak English. And we can actually see this happening because one of these poems is about how to calculate the date of Easter. This is not like inspiring, but it's super useful if you're a priest and you have to calculate the date of Easter. And so this is just sort of it's a mnemonic poem. But if the meter doesn't mean anything to you, then you can't really remember it. And so when this gets imported to the continent, the French and German speakers were like, what? Like, how can we be expected to memorize this? So there's a whole bunch of rewritings of this poem to make it fit the metrical structure that they understood. But the fact that it started out obviously by English speakers who just found it easier to remember something in the rhythms of English, even though it's in Latin, is a fascinating phenomenon. There's a few other poems of that sort that are in Old English meter.
We always like to close with some rapid fire questions. First one, of all the classes you've taught, what has been your favorite to teach?
Oh, wow, that's really hard. I mean, I do love teaching Intro Old English, I have to say. I teach it pretty much every year, but it's incredibly satisfying to get people from knowing no Old English to being able to close read a poem in Old English and to write their own projects in it. So I think, like, long term, I love Intro Old English.
Contemporary poets to recommend for those interested in medievalism or Old English?
Related to Old English or not?
Either.
Either, okay. W.H. Auden, I think, actually kind of crosses that. He was a really excellent metrist, but he also had a lot of interest in particularly Middle English. And some of his more experimental poems use the language of Old English and forms of Middle English in interesting ways. He's got out of fashion a bit, but I think is still well worth reading.
Then we have the big one we ask everyone. What is your number one piece of advice for people learning Old English today?
It's easier than you think, and you know a lot more already than you think. I think if you learn to pronounce Old English, you'll realize that you're already speaking a lot of it day to day. And once you've been able to lock your knowledge of modern English into the sounds of Old English, then you're already well on your way.
Well, thank you. This meeting's been great. I'm sure we've missed something, but we've really come out with a lot of new, interesting things to think about and work with in our club, and we are totally excited to share.
Thank you. This has been awesome.
Great. Well, it's been lovely talking to you both, and I hope you have a great break and keep on with doing the good work in Old English.
Thank you so
You
much.
too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today with our conversation with Dr. Emily Thornbury.
If you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did, please leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening on. It truly helps us reach more people and grow our mission.
If you have any questions or remarks, please leave them in the comments section below.
But for now,
Whiz Hal!